Hey, Rhys. Well, today is an exciting day for me. I don't know if you know, because the upload time on YouTube is definitely way after recording time, but it's about 1:30 in the morning for me. I finished your kitty cat not too long ago, and I was really, really proud of him. Every kitty that is Rhys's kitty is Rhys kitty to me. So, if he has a name, I'd be excited to know what it is, but I think you're going to love him. So, back to our book. We are reading The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Craner. We are at The Execution, 1810 to 1813. It's labeled 1, so The Execution, Chapter 1. Success is not in the idea, but the execution. Hey, strong start. Okay. Success is not in the idea, but the execution. This was the first lesson of my life of crime. It was only it was also my last, but I get ahead of myself. Here I was, a woman of 18, seemingly alone on the streets of Hamburg. My eyes were closed because what I needed to find was best found by hearing alone. This is what Hamburg sounded like. Cries of merchants trying to outcompete on prices for a clatter of ornate glassware from Venice, a shimmer of bells from the mountains of Francia, and a thud of oranges from southern Spain, packed in straw and wrapped in canvas to try to mitigate their decay. The wet breath of horses and the clatter of their hoofs, a swirl of German and French, a smattering of Dutch. Shouts in the strange guttural language of Luftnarp. The muffled growl of the ocean, providing the reason for everything else I was hearing. I let my mind drift over all of this, picking out the one sound I needed. There it was, a few words, in a dialect that was rare in this part of the world, a heavily coded slang used by certain sailors in the eastern Mediterranean. The chances of anyone but my target speaking that were, well, I had never had formal education in mathematics, but they didn't seem high. I opened my eyes and zeroed in on the rough-dressed men muttering and hurrying toward their ship. Picking my way carefully through the crowd after the men, I inclined my head slightly in their direction. In response to my command, the most beautiful man in the city, quite possibly in oh, quite possibly in I wish I could edit this better. Napoleon's entire flicker of an empire. Oh, okay, because Napoli doesn't exist anymore. Got you. Um, all right. Quite possibly in Napoleon's entire flicker of an empire stepped into their path. I say beautiful as an objective measure. His looks stopped activity in their tracks, and his smile caused symptoms that would give any doctor concern. His name was Andre du Levere. Liver. Liver. Anyway, he sounds so French. Andre broke into a smile that was both friendly and relieved, as though he had been looking all over the city for a filthy group of sailors and couldn't believe his luck that he had finally stumbled upon them. They frowned suspiciously as Andre lifted his arm in greeting. "My friends and comrades," he said. God, he was nearly irresistible when he spoke in that friendly voice. That was just the side of flirtation. I told you. I'm told you are the best crew in the North Sea. Oh, I'm told you are the best crew the North Sea has to offer. I'm so sorry. I'm stuttering so badly tonight. It is past my bedtime. All right. It would be impolite and perhaps impossible to disagree with such a compliment delivered with such a smile, and so they could only murmur as he strode with them toward their ship, laying his arm across the shoulders of one of them, causing him to jump nearly out of his rags. One would think that being so beautiful and charming, so impossible to forget, would be a detriment to a career of a thief, but Andre knew his tools and how to leverage them. A large hand fell onto my own shoulder, and I patted it without turning around. In the cacophony of the port, I hadn't heard Laura approach. Despite her monumental size, at least 2 feet taller than me, with thick ropes of muscle, Laura could move with utter grace and stealth. She was, through years of training and lived experience, extraordinarily aware of her body, the limit and length of it, and how to maneuver it through the world. Andre is putting on too much of a show, she grumbled. Oh, let him have his fun. The charming man in question had reached the ship, which was in the frantic process of unloading. Under the new Napoleonic law, ships were given free berth for the first half day. After that, a tax was exacted in the form of a length of wood from the ship's structure. Neither the crew nor the captain had any say in which part of the ship the wood was removed from, and it would be as harmless as a panel from the captain's wardrobe, or as vital as one of the ship's great ribs, leaving it floundering in the harbor's shallow waters. This process was repeated every half day until the ship either left the port or was decidedly no longer able to, at which point it would be confiscated by the French Empire. And so the sailors hauled crates and bundles down from the planks at a furious pace. Andre left a wake of stillness in his passage, as sailors and custom officials all stopped to gape. Gathering those nearby around him with vague beckoning of one hand, he began a long story, a story that had neither beginning nor end, but a nearly inexhaustible quality of middle, leaving Laura and I ample time to get our work done. We ducked around the piles of cargo, seeking a particular chest of daggers. The chest was set to be delivered to a peasant revolution growing in the frontiers of Svitz, a movement called the Green and White. Our job was to divert that delivery to the hands of the Duke's own, which would find a more profitable and less righteous use for their weaponry. We acted not out of partisan fervor, but because the pay was right. Motivation does not have to be complex. In our line of work, simple motives were generally better. Laura, barely having to raise herself up, located the chest at the top of the tallest stack and commenced heaving it out. I leaned nonchalantly against the crate, or as nonchalantly as I could. One sailor who was, for whatever reason, immune to Andre's charms, sauntered out from one of the rows and gaped at the young woman and the giant who were absconding with their goods. "Thieves!" he squalled. I am unsure why it is the crew cared so much, since they owned nothing on the ship or the dock other than their own clothes and the promise of future pay. And depending on their fortunes in the daily card games, sometimes not even that. But an element of pride made them fiercely protective of what they were unloading. And several abandoned Andre's morass of a story to charge us with his fist and whatever weapon happened to be in their hand. Unfortunately for them, they encountered Laura. who turned from her work just long enough to swat the first man to the ground with a tragic crack. I wouldn't have wished to be him in the coming weeks. As more men barreled in, Laura turned fully to engage them, and I tucked myself behind her. This position was somewhat safer, although I did find myself uncomfortably compressed every time she jostled backwards. From my position, I could not see the fight as it unfolded, but one only needs to hear so many bones break before one gets the gist. The sounds of violence were halted by one voice, habituated to immediate obedience. "Make way for her ladyship!" I peeked around Laura to see the guard who had spoken. A lackey, but a well-dressed and apparently well-paid one. Behind him, a woman in the kind of dress that takes nearly as long for her to put it on as it would for me to earn the money to afford it. She glanced at the mess of injured bodies with placid, polite eyes. A politician, then. Some royals were temperamental, but some are survivors, with the skill of hiding what they feel. Those were the ones that truly had to be watched out for. Sailors, who were still able to stand, all scattered as the woman and her rich hewn descended and crossed the port. None of us knew which royal family she belonged to, or even if they happened to be in possession of any kind of throne at the moment. The details of power rarely matter. What matters is the impression of power. My crew, of course, had been well trained to be immune to niceties, so Andre took the opportunity to give a quick goodbye wink to the ship's cook, and then performed a graceful dive off the dock into the filthy water of the harbor. Laura slung the heavy chest of daggers that now belonged to us onto her broad back, and the two of us began to hurry away. One of the sailors, bug-eyed with rage but unable to give chase without crossing the path of the woman, spat at us, and the saliva landed a few feet from the nobleman. A soft pop against the hot wood. The sailor groaned. The woman stopped and turned her head ever so slightly toward the offending man. Her men tensed behind her. After a few seconds, long enough to communicate volumes of conceivable torture, she turned back to her dignified walk. Her guards kept their glaring eyes on the crew of sailors, helpfully keeping them too terrified to chase after Laura and me. By the time the noblewoman was at a safe distance, we were long gone, and so the sailors went grumbling about their work, and later grumbling to their drink, a beer hall hanging over the water. Among them was the final member of my gang of thieves, one who was never noticed wherever she went. All right, we're on to chapter 2. Let me see how long it is. All right, next chapter. Reunited in the attic that was our temporary haven in Hamburg, we opened the heavy wooden chest and inventoried the daggers inside. They were mostly undecorated, although each hilt had been carved with the sigil of a pineapple, an exotic and ridiculous fruit. As we worked, we dodged bats, listened to the twittering of birds. Below us, we could hear every conversation, every potato dropped into every pot of water. It was an overload of sensory information. We were finishing up when someone started pounding at the trap door, and Andre clutched his chest in what was only half comedic exaggeration. Laura flung open the heavy trap door. a dagger decorated with the sigil of a pineapple hidden behind her back. A slight man, with a workman's clothes, crawled up into the attic. He was spattered with blood. "Rebecca!" I said in surprise. We had not expected her back for hours, if not days. Laura gently helped her up, and Rebecca peeled off the layers of false hair and painted on features, revealing the small Jewish woman with a preternatural ability to look like anyone but herself. "My God," said Andre, still holding his chest. "Rivka, what happened to you?" During the boring ship ride, she had once taught him her name in Hebrew, and he had found it delightful. Here it carried the tenderness he always especially showed her over all of us. I checked her for wounds, but she waved me away. "Not mine," she said. "Not my blood," she managed, with a shaking, quiet voice, to tell us what happened. Rebecca, a master of disguises, had been the crux of my plan. She had joined the sailors in their last voyage disguised as a wharf rat named Henrik, willing to do back-breaking work in exchange for transportation to Hamburg. After the fight and our successful theft, she had retired grumbling with her fellow sailors to the beer hall, where they had drunk and complained about thieves, and she had continued to gently try to guide them to the subject of where they received the chest of daggers that we had stolen. Our employers, as always, were the Duke's own, who suspected that the daggers had been taken from one of the armories by someone sympathetic to the cause of the Green and White Revolutionaries. The Duke's own were not a group of people who liked being stolen from, and any information we could give them on the movement of the chest would help them string up whoever was ultimately responsible. As the men grew drunker and the relief of another successful voyage settled in, Rebecca felt them getting closer to revealing what she needed to know, but just as she was guiding them the last little way, she felt a surge of adrenaline. She had spent years infiltrating the lowest and highest rungs of society, blending in seamlessly with every strata, and this had given her pitch-perfect ear for when a scene was about to turn bad, and as they chatted in that hall, she felt the scene shift suddenly and quite definitely bad. The door to the bar was kicked open, and soldiers marched in. More and more of them, carefully taking positions in the front of every possible exit. As soon as she saw this, Rebecca slid under the table. "Henrik?" called out one of her sailors, turning in confusion to find his friend gone. Rebecca crawled on her belly to the bar as the commander of the soldiers announced himself to the startled crowd. "Let it be known," the commander boomed. Conversation died out instantly, and everyone fidgeted with dangerous silence. "Let it be known," the soldier said again, "that Her Highness, the Lady Nora of the Royal House of Lumpnarp, was singularly disrespected while disembarking from her paid transportation to your filthy city. The penalty for insolence to royalty is death." None of the soldiers were among the men that Lady Nora had been traveling with earlier that day. Those had been shouting scarecrows, suitable for pushing a crowd around, but these men were skilled and dangerous. Rebecca, having wiggled her way into the little nook in the bar, began searching her bag for any disguise that could save her. The barkeep glanced down at her, the only one in the room who could see her, and she looked back with pleading eyes. He said nothing about her presence, and she silently thanked him for his kindness. Her bag contained a bewilderment of costume elements. It was too unwieldy to carry about entire disguises, and her skill was such that she didn't need them. Instead, she carried bits of clothing, small props, wigs, a false facial hair that could be assembled into some suggestion of a person then brought to irrefutable life by her performance. As quickly and neatly as she could, given the lack of mirrors and her awkward position, she altered herself to look like another barkeep. Fortunately for you lot, the soldier continued, Lady Nora is the soul of mercy, and so has granted her pardon. The room, as one, began to breathe again. Rebecca didn't pause at her work, rolling out from her nook, propping up from behind the bar, trying to sell through her posture the idea that she had been there the entire time, even though many soldiers saw her appear. Her ability to inhabit a truth was more convincing than their own wavering memories, and their eyes slid past her. As a result of this pardon, we will only behead 1 in 3 men in this room. Soldiers, gather them. There was an outcry and some desperate attempts to fight, but the soldiers were well armed and utterly ruthless, and even before the crowd was gathered, already several men lay dead. One of the soldiers eyed the two barkeeps, but the commander waved him away. Not them, he said. The sailors. And so Rebecca was saved. But still she had to stand and watch. The soldiers were true to their word, and they were very efficient. Having finished her story, she slumped back into the attic floor, futilely closing her eyes against the memory. Thanks to the Lord that you are safe, said Laura. Yes, I would have been heartbroken, said Andre. I said nothing, only held her hand and felt relief with each pulse of her heart. Finally I spoke. Who in the hell, I said, is this Lady Nora of Lumpnarp? We'll move on to chapter 3 next time.